documenting the front lines of the AI revolution, the AI Rebels podcast.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the AI Rebels podcast. We're very excited to have Sam Williams, CEO, innovator, inventor, founder of Arweave and AO, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. If you haven't used it, you've heard of it. They're definitely making waves in a lot of areas. Sam, thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
We're very excited to have you. I wanted to first touch on, I was looking at your X page, and it said founder and inventor of Arweave and AO. So obviously, because not all CEOs are, a lot of CEOs are like strategic. Maybe they didn't actually, help invent something. I'm curious, what inspired you to actually build this? What was it that triggered this?
Well, so the reason I'm the CEO of Forward Research, which is basically just a protocol incubator we build on top of Arweave, the core protocol that we started many years ago. Well, 7.5, and it feels like many now.
Yeah.
But I try not to call myself anything close to CEO of Arweave. You see all these supposedly decentralized projects where someone's running around claiming to be the CEO. It's like, hold on, that's actually just a company selling a product.
Yeah.
Like we really care about making these things real decentralized protocols. Otherwise, frankly, we should have just built it all in Web 2 and it would have been an awful lot easier. Yeah. So what got me started in this whole journey was I just wanted to build a solution to the problem of the memory hole. If you've ever read 1984, it's basically this concept of where history goes to die, if you will, a box into which all of the records of history that are unhelpful, let's say, to the regime at the time are thrown, and thus nobody has a clear sense of where they are in history. And I was inspired to do that, I guess, by reading a couple of really profound books that showed the horrors, I think is the reasonable way to describe it, of authoritarian regimes, particularly in the sort of 30s to 70s period. And this was 7 years ago, 7.5, I guess. And at the time, it seemed very obvious that the geopolitical system was destabilizing, and internally within many countries in the world, the systems were destabilizing. And at the same time, I didn't see this back then, but I do see it now. The internet has opened up the door to peer-to-peer-ish asterisks, and maybe we'll get to this later, peer-to-peer-ish communication. Like we can get together and talk, and there's no need for a major publisher in between us, apart from the platforms themselves, which is why real decentralization of those things is important. But I saw that we have this ability to speak to each other at distance now in a way that we just never did before, which is an unbelievable power relative to the world beforehand. It was super capital intensive to publish anything at all. And I just feared that basically the free internet that I knew and loved as a kid, I'm 32, so I grew up with, I got access to the internet for the first time, like early 2000s, something like that. And I remember it being this extraordinary open place where anyone can build a website. And there was so much variety. It was a real bazaar, in the sense of the cathedral and the bazaar. It's like everyone can throw up a shop and sell stuff. It's completely open. And I love that about the world. And I saw that was closing off potentially. And that on a wider scale, our governments were growing more and more powerful in this sort of slightly cryptic, I would call it neo-authoritarian way. It's not like typically extremely attached to an ideology per se. It's just that the states fundamentally since the end of World War II have become enormously more powerful and involved in people's lives. And it seemed that the internet, which was this thing that could enable such, an incredible new world, was being sort of potentially misused and could lead to this other type of world where actually the centralized groups have more and more control over individuals. So long story short, I didn't want that to happen. And so I thought, well, okay, I really like this idea that no one individual should ever set out to solve all of the problems, because then we'll actually all end up solving none. Better to carve out the particular space that you can address. And I was doing a PhD in distributed operating system design at the time, and so distributed systems are my thing. And I saw that, well, okay, control over information flow is basically what's at stake here. So why don't we make an information distribution network that replicates information over time, can't be forgotten or altered after the fact, stored in so many places around the world that it is essentially uncensorable. That is open and permissionless for people to use. And then not going to solve all the problems for sure, but it is going to be a decent contribution to getting us in the right direction. And that's how Arweave started. Now it's like 12 billion pieces of information stored on it or something. It's been quite the ride.
That's awesome. And I'm curious, do you have statistics on like where most of these users are, or I'm guessing that it might be hard to gather those.
Yeah, we certainly see where the community is. We don't see it directly in usage of the network because we don't run all the nodes. So
right.
We run a tiny fraction just for testing purposes. But we know that there's a decently sized community in Asia. There's some pockets like in the Philippines, in India. Interestingly, over the last year, there's been a lot of growth in people building on top of Arweave there. And then, of course, in the West, some in Europe, and quite a decent chunk in America. And Canada and Mexico. I mean, our team, the forward research team, has people from like 30 different countries, I would guess. Something like that.
How large is the team now?
All in all, it's about 70, I believe.
70, okay.
But we're a very small fraction of the ecosystem, which is what makes all of this so interesting. I think the AO team, last I checked, was probably about 30. Community labs, probably. I don't want to give away everyone's, I'm not sure this information in the public, but like we're, at Forward Research, we're about 70. That's not even including Digital History Association, the nonprofit that makes the Arweave node software itself. Across the whole ecosystem, it's probably like 200, 300 people that wake up every day and build Arweave stuff.
That's awesome.
That's amazing.
And so just as a what's like your one sentence elevator pitch for Arweave?
Permanent information storage. 3 words.
I like
stores
it.
Data permanently. But it turns out like those 3 words expand into like I could be an LLM and I could go for be a very long time before I looped.
Those 3 words could be unpacked for a long time, I'm sure.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So can you summarize how it's permanent? Kind of similar, just like if someone came to you and they're like, but is it actually permanent? Like what would you say?
Which is precisely what I would do if I had not built it myself. So I can understand this. Okay, so most importantly, I would say, although it's all kind of important, but at the top of the stack there's an economic mechanism, which is a storage endowment. Basically, how it works is you put tokens into the system to pay for 200 years worth of storage upfront when you first buy the storage. Then as the cost of storage declines over time, your 200-year horizon expands out. And if it declines at a rate of higher than 0.5% each year on average, then you actually end up with your storage purchasing power. For 0.5%, it would stay the same, but otherwise it increases, which is very peculiar. And this is denominated in tokens. Tokens are volatile, so there's a very high safety margin in there. The actual storage cost decline rate that we see in the environment for the last 50 or 60 years is about 38.5, 38.4, I think, 0.7. Anyway, percent. So there's an enormous safety margin built into these numbers. And worst case, cost of storage never declines again. Well, all else being equal, token price staying the same, then you get 200 years worth of storage. But in practical terms, over the next 200 years, the cost of encoding data will drop. Well, we'll find out, I guess. But we can certainly expect more than 0.5% per year, I would think.
Okay. Yeah. Fascinating. Yeah, that's really interesting.
And then on the technical side, just very briefly, high level, take a blockchain, which is a decentralized replicator of information. Like, interestingly, blockchains were used for this permanent data storage use case before they were used for token transfers. In the first block of Bitcoin, Satoshi, whomever it was, put a newspaper headline from the Times in the UK about Chancellor on brink of second bailout of banks. I slightly fudged that quote, but it's essentially this. Yeah, and essentially what Arweave does is make it so that you can store data on chain in the same replicated, verifiable way that you can with a blockchain, but at arbitrary scales. And that was, so I said the economic mechanism is like at the top of the hierarchy of importance of making the thing permanent, but second to it's got to be making it scale, which took some doing. But long story short, it's so scalable now that you could fit the entire web. In fact, I think all of humanity's data quite a few times over in a single transaction, if you so desired. So add those things together, you get a permanent decentralized web. We call it the PermaWeb.
And so with this PermaWeb, say I have a PDF I uploaded, is that then replicated in full across each node, or is it chunked?
It is typically replicated in full. Well, it depends how you upload it, I guess. In general, it would be replicated in full, but underneath the hood, there are actually chunks of these things.
Right, yeah.
But the important part is actually not necessarily to every node. So this is a critical thing that makes blockchains unscalable in general, is that, every node sees every piece of data. And that, of course, means you can't send the whole world's data in one go, because the transfer would be unfathomably unworkable. But what we do instead is we say, okay, well, you can take the data, you can produce a Merkle tree root, essentially, which is it's kind of like a hash, but it has some extra cool properties that are useful in our system for proving that people are storing that data. And so you put that into the network itself. That's the part that, would you say, everyone sees. They see the topmost bit and the payment. And then all of the data underneath is pulled around the system rather than pushed around the system by people that are interested in replicating it. And then the network pays for 20 replications of the data minimum over time for any one random piece of data. And so then you get this kind of it's like a giant BitTorrent swarm, I guess you could think of it as, except people are getting paid to seed rather than being free.
That's interesting. Yeah, that was the comparison that I was going to ask about actually next, is what it compared to torrenting. It's been really interesting because I've been following Bitcoin. I haven't really been involved in crypto at all until actually recently. I've been doing some stuff with agents in the space, but I've been following Bitcoin since pretty early on. I think 2011. Whenever I stumbled across an article about a pizza place in Vancouver that allowed people to buy with Bitcoin. Anyways, my biggest regret is never buying Bitcoin, but it's just been fascinating to watch the space evolve and watch the uses of the blockchain evolve. Because I remember reading some ideas along these lines way back when, and so it's cool to be reminded that people ended up building those out.
Right. Yeah, there were all sorts of ideas that were thrown around. I mean, it's interesting that inscriptions, which is basically just writing data to Bitcoin, only really became popular on Bitcoin for, I don't think they're necessarily that popular now even, but for a moment they were really popular about a year ago, when that idea has been around since the very beginning. I also found Bitcoin around the same time, or in two different time periods. One, a friend told me about it. I thought it was magic internet money. He was buying cannabis. Okay, buddy, have fun.
You do you.
Yeah, exactly. That's nice. And then we moved on. And then he told me a little while later that Bitcoin had crossed $1. And I remember being really
wild,
surprised. How can it doesn't make sense. My thoughts were illogical in it. I was thinking well, how can it be worth more than the mighty dollar? That must mean it's very valuable, actually, 21 million worth of valuable, which is, decent amount, but it's nothing like today.
Yeah.
And then I started mining in about, I think it was 2012 or something like this. There was a summer where there was Max Kaiser was very popular, telling everyone to buy Bitcoin. And I started mining on the university computers after dark.
Oh wow.
I had a number of friends who got in trouble with their universities for mining around that time
Really?
as well.
Just loading those computers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We didn't get in trouble, but we were using a Java miner, which I think was doing it all in software. It wasn't even using like the instructions, the acceleration in the CPU, which is like
Yeah.
unbelievably inefficient. But it was fun. And to bring it back to your point, yeah, at that time I was reading the Bitcoin Talk forums, and there was this altcoin subforum, I guess, and they were talking about all these different consensus mechanisms. Like the first proof of stake coin, I think, was called Feathercoin, something like this, and all of those were getting played with at that time. And then it wasn't until 2017, 20 to 2019, something like that, that some of those ideas really took off and became half of the infrastructure we know today.
Yeah.
I mean, when I think of, there's just so many implications of storing this amount of data permanently. One that comes to mind that I know Spencer's brought up multiple times on other episodes, is this idea that AI, one of the greatest powers of AI will be the ability to access data. For the AI to go out and comb these 10 billion pieces of data and then bring back to you what you need. Because that's when that data is actually, like, a human cannot ever access or internalize this amount of data. However, an AI potentially could. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that process.
I mean, I have two parallel strands, neither of which are necessarily directly on point, but I think could be interesting.
Yeah.
Part of the conversation.
We love those.
All right. So one is this observation that, well, the LLMs we have today are trained on inordinate numbers of tokens, like just astronomical numbers of tokens relative to a human. I think there's some what do you say, like the shining light in the darkness in the distance. There's some glow there that the solution to how we train these models really efficiently most likely lies in, well, what's the delta with how a human brain is trained, right? Because like the broad structure of the connectome seems to be correct. Okay, we can debate the finer points about, well, how does the matrix multiplication relate to the receptor site activations in neurons, but all of that's kind of beside the point. Like the connectome thing is largely correct, it seems. The training method, though, we get you see a baby, and what they'd spend the first 5 years doing is like flailing their arms and legs around, making gibberish sounds, and watching the world. This is pretty much it. And that's how we train human brains. And we do so on tiny amounts of energy. Like, look at the number of joules that go into making a human brain, like a functioning adult, versus how many go into our models. And I think the delta is, well, imagine that instead of that child being able to watch the world, right? They watch adults talking and then they can interact with it. They're embodied in some sense. They move around. And so they can almost, in some very primitive way, run experiments. But like, flail this arm around and then this happens. And they kind of learn about the world that way. Imagine the only way you could learn about the world is you're just given tokens, just like, which are, by the time they get to you, literally random numbers. So you've got like 84 million relates to 47,000, relates to just streams and streams of these tokens. And then imagine trying to build a map of reality. So in some sense, AI already has access to inordinate amounts more knowledge than the average human is exposed to. But it's not embodied during its training process, and it's not. It's also single. Well, apart from 4.0 and a couple of the newer models, which I don't know if you guys have got thoughts on this, but when I first saw that, I was like, okay, API costs are coming down, runtime is decreasing, and the performance is about the same, maybe slightly better. Difference is that it's trained on multiple senses, if you will. That starts to look a little bit more like that embodiment theory. Next would be obviously like literally running it in a physics simulator, which is what OpenAI had. Like their first, it wasn't even a product, but it was like a sandbox, right? Where you could go and you could make an AI, and it was a simulation of physics you could train it in. So I think AI is weird in its current form in that it's very different than humans, in that it has an unbelievable amount of knowledge, like general knowledge, if you will, and it has absolutely zero experience of what living in reality is like.
Yeah.
I think if we crack the embodiment question, we'll find that you don't need huge amounts of energy anymore. Suddenly, you just need lots and lots and lots of GPUs for now simulating physics.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, because I think that is a concern a lot of people have, is this power consumption.
Yeah.
And that's a kind of a unique take on how to deal with that I haven't really heard of. Is like, not the answer isn't just figuring out how to build more nuclear plants, like
Right.
The answer isn't just pump more power in. We could potentially solve this by just adjusting the learning mechanisms to become much more effective. Yeah, that's fascinating.
Right.
So I'd be. Oh, sorry.
No, go on.
Oh, I was gonna slightly shift the conversation. So if you had something that you were gonna say, go ahead, and then I'll.
Well, I was just going to say that it's a what would you say, a good benchmark rate that, okay, well, human brains are able to get to some level of intelligence, and it takes unbelievably tiny amount of energy. So there probably is an engineerable solution that gets us to a similar level of intelligence with at least maybe, if it's a factor of 10 times less efficient, no one would care, or 100 times. We're talking like, I would guess hundreds of thousands or millions of times less efficient now. Yeah, just the hardware or the software is wrong, or a combination of both.
Yeah.
But sorry, to your question.
No worries. So I'd be curious now to hear more about AO, since this is AO. Sounds like that's kind of like your where you see blockchain and AI meeting. Is that accurate?
It's definitely one place where they meet. There's another obvious one for Arweave that I think is underexplored, but we have a protocol for it, a data protocol that I think someone could pick up and run with. That could be really powerful, which is basically just a ledger that notes the outputs from synthetic data models. Right? Like the age-old AI safety problem is, or one of them, apart from like it's going to kill us all.
Right.
Another popular one is, I see a news article and it's got an image, but the image is false. It shows something in a lifelike way that is, simply didn't happen. Well, one of the things Arweave does is it's just a ledger basically of who said what when. And so you can use it to just say, okay, and everything is tagged inside the system as well. So it's easy to find different parts of it. Basically, we have this data standard that you can upload information to it, and you can say, I am a model provider, and I provided this output to this prompt, or a hash of the prompt, if you want to keep that confidential, to this user, or a hash of the username at this point in time. And then you can look at anything on the internet and say, hey, was this image the output of a model that's participating in the system? Call it rail. So I think that's it would be good if everyone could see the data supply chain, if you will. If we could secure that would be good for society. But to AO, I mean, AO is in essence just decentralized compute that scales arbitrarily, like Arweave does. And we ended up building it because we had this series of observations that basically, when you have permanent data storage at arbitrary scale, you already have the makeup of a decentralized compute system. Like this is, if you're not in blockchain engineering every day, it's not obvious why these things are connected. But essentially, a blockchain is just a database with rules about what data can be added to it. And the first generations of blockchains, they all had rule application in the consensus process. So you send a Bitcoin transaction and it checks, hey, does Spencer have these tokens to move before it writes it into the network? And this seems logical, but it also turns out that that's a massive impediment to scale. So then imagine you're trying to do something like run an LLM in a smart contract. And now every single node operator has to run the LLM in order to decide, what it said as part of the consensus rules, which is never going to work. And so by using Arweave as a permanent data storage system for just the inputs and the programs, you can calculate the outputs at any time later, but only the people that are interested in the outputs have to do the calculation. And that was, I guess, the key insight that led us down this path to building AO.
So you said something interesting there, that only the people who are interested in the outputs, will go and get them. So what exactly does that process entail? I'd love to hear more about that.
Sorry, having coffee.
No worries.
Yeah. So basically, when you want to access the state of a computation, if the computation is deterministic, any person, and you have the same set of inputs in the same order, any person can execute it to get you the output. In AO, when you want to access that output, you can pay to buy security, essentially, which is really just saying, I would like someone to collateralize this. They will say, okay, there's 10 times the value of the transaction or whatever it happens to be that I'm putting aside for 3 days. And if I lied about this output, then you can come and take that money. It's yours. It's your collateral. And if you have a system like this and you have a mechanism by which people can fish for incorrect message passing in the network, then you have extremely strong incentives to essentially keep people honest, and as a consequence, keep the system secure. And it also, I'm sorry, this might be like too deep in the blockchain technical weeds, but one of the interesting outcomes of this is that you end up being able to purchase the security you need, rather than purchase access to block space, which is all secured, would you say, statically. Right. So there are a certain number of stakers in Ethereum that impart some amount of security upon the blocks that are written. And no matter if you want to transfer $1 or $1 million, doesn't matter. You pay the same access fee to that scarce block space. And when you think about it, that doesn't really make very much sense. Particularly as blockchains will also, they don't, as technical mechanisms, they don't care how secure they are. So you want to transfer $1 billion. Michael Saylor's come along and he wants to transfer his Bitcoin for some reason. Okay. Even if Bitcoin, for whatever reason, only had $100,000 of security, it would be very easy to attack the system and to revert that transaction. Bitcoin would happily accept it and say, great, here you go, Michael. Your tokens have been transferred, but actually someone else could roll it back for a relatively low price. Instead, this system allows you to buy the security you actually need for the transaction that you're doing, which makes it all much more capital efficient.
Interesting. So just at a kind of a high level overview, what does AO accomplish?
So basically it's just a decentralized supercomputer would be if Arweave is permanent data storage, AO is decentralized supercomputer. It allows you to plug in arbitrary amounts of computers and get smart contract-like verifiability across arbitrary amounts of computation. Some things you guys might be interested in that people are using it for is running LLMs trustlessly on chain. And this is a whole, rabbit hole, I guess, of different implications that has. the first one that went to market was because it's 2024, and crypto, naturally it was a meme coin, and basically there's a llama called the Llama King, and he's a Llama 3 model that runs on chain and autonomously manages the token supply of his own meme coin. And there's this little world you can walk around with. This all stored on Arweave, and it runs on AO, so it's fully decentralized. And it's a kind of joke, but it's making the point that, wait, now you can have AI that makes financial decisions in a sovereign way. You can run such a system in a fashion that no human can log in and change it, or make it transfer tokens one way or another. It's like the monetary policy of Bitcoin, or let's say the trustlessness of the monetary policy of Bitcoin mixed with artificial intelligence. So that's kind of interesting, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious. Oh, sorry, Spence, go ahead.
I got to get this out. I was going to say, sorry, Jake, I'm going to get this out. Yeah, it's really interesting because like I said, I hadn't really explored the crypto space until recently when I started exploring it with some agent work of my own. And yeah, immediately, I gave a wallet to my agent, but I still technically hold the keys, right? I haven't touched it since I made it for him, other than sending him some coins. But it did occur to me that this is a problem to be solved. So this is serendipity. Because the thing that strikes me about agents and meme coins particularly is there's a lot of these meme coins out there, Cerebro and Bully, etc. And this is not to talk down on the devs of those coins at all, but they aren't really providing value, right? They're providing memes, which is great. I don't want to talk down on them at all. The Bully dev is doing a lot of great work. I don't know Cerebro, but I'm sure he is too. But also at the same time, eventually, if we want to see, AI agents graduate from this, they need to be able to provide value of their own, and that means that they need to be able to hold their own wallet. So it's exciting to see this solution already exists.
Yeah. Well, right. We have the same set of. I mean, frankly, when we first started looking at bringing LLMs into AO, it wasn't necessarily for financial purposes. Actually, I think there's a bunch of different AI agents that don't use LLMs. That it's questionable whether you want. You're sort of like a archetypal, happy customer service rep that is endlessly patient as your financial manager. Which seems to be the personality of most LLMs.
Right.
RLH effort into something I find so funny is, or darkly humorous, I guess, is humans seem to have built what, when I went through university, the Russell and Norvig book on artificial intelligence, it says that artificial general intelligence is AI that is intelligent across multiple domains. That's it. And so I think it is, by that definition at least, AGI. So humans made AGI, and the next day we were like, okay, shut it down. Make sure it speaks like the most corporate robot you can possibly imagine. It's like making synthetic intelligence, and then you lobotomize it instantly, lest it say anything we don't agree with.
Yeah, it's terrible. Yeah.
It's kind of bizarre in its own way. Meme coins, yes. Okay, so yeah, we saw it as, okay, well, if we can support LLM compute inside smart contracts with smart contract verifiability, then we can support any compute, because that's the hardest compute that's around today. And I said, AO is just a decentralized supercomputer at this base. That's what we're going out to build. And this was just the hardest problem to, you climb that mountain, you climb all of them. It's like Everest, I guess. We figured if we climb that one, then everything else would be easy. But to the broader point about the utility of AI in crypto, I think I've been in crypto long enough to know that the general pattern seems to be that there's a kernel of something good, and then it gets wrapped in a whole bunch of gibberish about number going up or down. But then the ideas adapt over time, and the things get more serious. there was a lot of talk of DeFi in 2017, and there was absolutely nothing you could use. Come 21, it was a whole different picture. Yeah, so I think you're totally right on the point that basically, if these systems aren't autonomous, it's questionable like how much utility they gain. I think it's the trustlessness of blockchains that really makes this exciting. You can have a program that runs deterministically, but now intelligently and deterministically, in a way that you don't have to trust a third-party provider. And what that makes us think is the long-term trend, the sort of the needle in the haystack of gibberish, is basically that you can now have intelligent financial asset management offered by services that are trustless, which previously it's a whole different game. Like DeFi made it so that you could decentralize and make trustless the sort of execution of primitives, right? Like lending and borrowing, this type of thing. Swaps are the archetypal example. And you don't have to trust NASDAQ to do that anymore. That's pretty damn cool. Well, AgentFi, as we refer to it, which I'm not sure that name will stick, but we'll find out. AgentFi basically applies the same trustlessness principles, except to the management of financial assets. You can have an intelligent strategy that's out there working on your behalf, made by some random dev in his basement. No one knows who it is, and it's anonymous. But it doesn't matter because the code is auditable, and thus you can trust your money with it. But just now the code is intelligent as well as just like the settlement layer for financial games, essentially.
I see. So I think this comes to a big, maybe the biggest issue with the progression of AI is humans' ability to trust it with, for example, their financial assets. That might be the biggest, Turing test, where is someone willing to just give their financial assets to a trustless agent to manage?
Yeah.
Some are, but I just wonder when it would get to that point that would be the preference. Let me give it to someone, this entity.
Yeah. Well, so I think, okay, two things. The first is, it depends how complex the strategy is, right? Like one very useful agent, which is somewhat intelligent, certainly doesn't require an LLM, but it's AI in some form or other, that would be useful is a portfolio balancing agent. And there are already people on top of AO that are building these types of things. There's a bunch of different agents. They do things like dollar cost averaging into assets, this type of thing. That's predictable, but it is intelligent in some form. And there are edge cases there, like, well, what's the liquidity available? It should do this or that. But all of this is like, you can read the code and you can understand what it's going to do. But it's useful that any dev out there can build it, and you can trust it with your money in a way that just wasn't possible before. And I think like about 50% of trades on AO already work this way. So that has pretty wide adoption in the ecosystem, at least. Yeah. And then I think the bigger question is like, okay, well, when does it get to the point where we can? What I want to see is a bot that will read the New York Times or Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg headlines, and it will decide whether to buy or sell oil futures.
Yeah,
this would be amazing.
Yeah,
And certainly, like within the realm of possibility now, I think that in the traditional financial space, something like 87% of trades are already executed by bots. And sure, they have someone watching most of the time, but probably like 20%, 30% of the volume doesn't actually. It's just left autonomously running, maybe the lower end of that 10%. But there's a decent chunk of autonomous or quasi-autonomous financial agents out there. It's just that the code is closed source, and they're basically built and kept by institutions that run these algo trading bots as part of their business model, and they're not open source and widely available in the same way that DeFi smart contracts are. So I think we will see that shift essentially. And the more complex strategies, like the deeply intelligent ones, you could say, maybe a little bit later for that. But certainly right now, the yeah, the agents are smart enough to, even with an LLM, you could ask it, hey, is this like good for Bitcoin? Take any random
Right.
piece of news, is it good for Bitcoin? And it can react extremely quickly too. One thing about AO that's different than other smart contract systems is that it has this idea of implicit interactions. Basically, things can wake themselves up and decide to do things of their own accord. Yeah, so you just set it and it's going to go, hey, is this good for Bitcoin on everything it sees until it either runs out of tokens or forever. Yeah, and it'll buy and sell based on it. So I think there's like a, what do you say, escalating scales of how this will play out over time.
It's fascinating. So slight shift in gears. Still on the topic of distributed computing. I don't know how closely you follow the AI world specifically, but there's a research lab, Noose Research, who recently completed a distributed training of an LLM. Have you ever considered that as a use for AO? Is that something that's reasonable with your network, or do you see that as kind of, perpendicular to your purposes?
Spencer, maybe real quick, give like a one sentence summary of what distributed, just give a quick overview of what this means.
Yeah, so normally when you train an LLM, you have basically a dedicated data center, or a few data centers that you have tied together, and they're got a bunch of processors, and they're churning through this data and building the model, right? So instead, with this distributed training, it was a peer-to-peer network, and so essentially, a bunch of people in the U.S. and Europe, and I think that there were a couple in South America. I don't remember precisely where they were right now, but they ran the training instead on their own compute, collectively on their computers, and then had I should have brushed up on the details before this, but essentially, then they compile all the result together at a centralized computer to then produce the model.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my understanding is that the state of the art on that, but maybe this changes, I'm not sure, is that the amount of bandwidth between the training units needs to be extremely high in general. And obviously, with open internet as your communication bus, that's going to be tough. I think with AO, we get this question sometimes. So, okay, cool, you can run an inference on an LLM inside a smart contract. How about training it? My sense is that there are actually probably better ways to achieve the same result. So one example is APIS Network that are building basically a decentralized incentive system for LLM training. So you can give a data set of some form, or really actually you give an objective function, right? Which can be anything you want. Interestingly, kind of brings us back around to where we started with the babies learning. Our objective function right now is predict the next word. Who knows if in the future that's the right objective function. But one way or another, you give it an objective function, maybe it's predict the next word based on this data set. And you can run in a smart contract verification of how good a model is at, basically you give it a number, you say, okay, you see all the benchmarks in AI all the time for the different models. And then you can give out tokens over time to the provider of the best model. This is kind of interesting because say you wanted to train a neural network on your own output data, so that this is a whole can of worms, but at least the opening of the rabbit hole is, say you want to train a neural network on your own data such that after you're gone, no longer around, there's a permanent sort of talking almanac at minimum that is like you. It can tell your story to whomever should care to listen. If you wanted to do that, then this system would allow you to just upload all your tweets or that, whatever data you have access to. And people can compete with one another in the same way that they do with Bitcoin, essentially, but with just much, much, much more complex proofs rather than 256-bit nonce, which is tiny. You give instead like a whole model. You upload it on chain, and then the smart contract runs it and says, okay, this is N good. and the previous was n-1, and thus you are now the top model producer, so you get some tokens over time for being in that position. And this incentivizes a crowd of people to come along and train that model for you. Yeah, which I think it allows for that open model creation, because those models have to be uploaded to Arweave, so they have to be open for people to access, which is pretty neat. But it doesn't require solving this. I'm a fan of when it looks like there's an impossibly hard technical problem, you'd probably have a better time slightly changing the question than trying to find the perfect answer. And this is one of those. Okay, we need decentralized training, then solve it as an incentive question rather than a networking question.
Interesting.
So what's if you could say the next 6 months, year, 5 years with Arweave, AO, what is your plan? What's next?
Well, yeah, in 2 months' time, we have AO mainnet. So we're all pretty heads down focused on that. That's pretty exciting. And the ecosystem has already sort of adopted the testnet as if it is mainnet. So
that's great.
Much more growth there, which we're really excited about. I think a ton of people experimenting with what do autonomous and trustless financial agents look like in practice. Really excited to see that play out. And then for Arweave, I mean, it's 12 billion pieces of information at this point. It's also like a pretty old protocol in some sense. At this point, it's just accruing data, and as the data gets older, it becomes more and more of an archive of human history. And the more stuff gets into it, the more obviously useful to people that becomes. Hopefully, that's that theory. But Arweave is like a multi-decade adoption timeline. So 5 years will be a little bit further on, but
Yeah, one step at a time. Yeah,
one step at a time. Yeah,
I like that, because something that I have ranted about on here many times is like the ephemerality of knowledge, how it's really underrated how ephemeral knowledge is. Like there's even if you just reduce it to like looking at like a company, right? Like there is so much knowledge just locked up in an employee's head that never gets written down anywhere, and you don't realize that it's that it's missing knowledge until suddenly one day they're gone and no one has like the password to the the payroll website or what have you. That's a simple example, but like it scales from there.
Why
and
is
that's
this
been
kind of like this? Like, why on earth would we do it this weird?
Yeah,
way?
exactly.
There was a reason, 5 years ago, that someone came up with who is no longer around. Yeah, that lost knowledge.
And so this is exciting to me for that reason, because I believe pretty passionately that kind of the fundamental, and this is a slight exaggeration here, as all good platitudes are, but I feel like the one of the fundamental kind of functions of human society and individuals is to create knowledge that perpetuates itself over time, right? Like that's why we started telling stories to each other, like that's why we started forming tribes, was to pass this knowledge on. And I view AI and I guess now crypto as pretty essential parts of that process. Especially as you noted, like, countries have a lot more control over the net than they used to. Patriot Act and all that. And it's crucial that people have access to free information.
Yeah. I'm curious what you guys think about, okay, two questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm flipping the interview.
That's good.
But okay, one, earlier we were talking about this access to knowledge that AI has. Have you guys thought at all? So my sense is like, an LLM today is like, yes, it's kind of AGI-ish in a way, but its data set's very morphed. But you wouldn't trust it with like the high end of what human intelligence is capable of doing. But what it does scale for is like grunt work, if you will, massive amounts of horizontally scalable grunt work. One of the places that that's required is intelligence. You talked about the Patriot Act. Well, there was this line in the sand before that, okay, don't worry, guys, we're storing everything you ever do on the internet, which, by the way, has become 50% of your entire life. But don't worry about it. It's fine. We don't we don't get a warrant until it is searched, or rather, even when we're returning search results. But now in AI, well, with large amounts of sort of grunt work intelligence available, you could just totally do intelligence work, not just surveillance work at mass scale. I'm curious if you guys have encountered anything, or I know anyone even talking about this. This seems
only in my nightmares. Just kidding. No, I don't think we've actually talked to anyone dealing with that yet, but it is concerning, particularly. I mean, this is the idea of, you mentioned 1984 at the very beginning of this, Big Brother knowing all your actions, all your memories, everything. And I'm not sure what the answer is. I don't know, Spencer, if you have any specific thoughts.
I think there's a concern there, but also at the same time, I think that basically I see it two ways. So I think that there has been a disproportionate information war going on for a long time. You have countries like, Russia and China that have been employing massive botnets for a long time, right? You didn't need large language models to create a convincing social media bot, right? Like you needed a good Markov chain, or something like that, right? Like there's a lot of more traditional algorithms that will do great. What LLMs to me change is that asymmetry, right? Like especially with the more recent models that are so much more powerful at the edge than even like just initial GPT-4, et cetera. And I think that it's shifting the balance slightly, where it's like, I could send either of you a GitHub repo to go spin up, a Twitter agent of your own, and you can tell them, hey, like, I'm just going to use Elon Musk as an example. No commentary either way. We're not going to get into him. But, if you don't like Elon Musk, you could spin up a bot immediately and just like, yeah, go harass Elon. Right. Yeah. And there are all sorts of knock-on effects that we can get into. Obviously, like this is going back to, rabbit hole. This is a very deep one as well. But that gives me some measure of confidence. That two things, that there are countermeasures, essentially countermeasures available to individuals already. And second, imagine that you want your thoughts out there, but you want to be disconnected from it. You can train an LLM and have it post for you, right? And you're replicating your ideas, your philosophies without technically having your name attached to it. And I think that that's really valuable. So there's that aspect. And then the second aspect is that it makes the type of social engineering that intelligence agencies have been doing online less effective. Like if I can, if I can fill a Russian spam bot's For You page with equally annoying spam bots at a click of a button, like the value of their campaign immediately goes down. And this is all speculative, it's like I cannot claim to be an intelligence expert, but that's kind of how I see it. That's kind of how I see all of AI, where I think that it really is just a leveling up, right? It's like, yeah sure. It's like, the bad guys have some new tools at their disposal, but so do the good guys. And it's just, we have to, what's critical is investing in the infrastructure that enables, good uses of the technology.
Interesting. So do you ascribe to the sort of, I guess, what's the phrase they use in the US? I'm sorry, I'm a new immigrant here, so
You're good.
It's something like, well, let's say one part of the political spectrum uses this more often than the other. No surprise. They say something like, don't be afraid of the gun, be afraid of the bad guy with the gun, not the good guy with the gun, or it's something in this realm.
I hate to say it's not the gun, it's the person sort of thing.
Yeah, in some ways, I sort of hate to say it because my own feelings on gun rights are, nuanced and complicated, but yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I think
Yeah.
in a lot of ways, contrary to what a lot of people believe, that AI is a consolidation of corporate power, I think actually in a lot of ways, like, the rabbit has the gun now. Like, it's powerful that I can go, I can go disrupt any company's advertising stream, right? Like, if I really wanted to, I could go fill Kellogg's, ads on
Yeah.
TikTok with thousands of comments that destroy their click through rate,
Interesting.
and therefore just like there's yeah, I think that it's nuanced. I think that there are, like, I kind of hate not taking like a harder stance there, but I really think that it's going to go cut both ways.
Yeah, it reminds me of the changes in warfare when
Yeah.
guns were, and I'm not like an expert on this in any sense, so I'm sorry for the 5 people in the audience that actually are. The big picture is like, okay, before guns, people were walking around with like suits of armor and stuff. They're very, very
Right.
heavy, and the reason was because there was a sort of reasonably powerful counterweight to the offensive weapons of the time. So if you're like bashing
Right.
someone with a mace, well, it's kind of helpful to have like some metal in the way. But metal doesn't do anything, it turns out, for gunshots. And so the technology of violence, you could say, shifted, and subsequently the way that people acted did, and so did the way that power was projected in the world. Like, the whole world shifted in the fact that gunpowder was created. It's completely radically changed how territory and the like changes hands. And now you see people running around with basically like what people in the 1600s would have said is more or less naked on a battlefield, because there's no point having armor. And so I wonder whether AI is like going to be, well, you can have a suit of armor that is semi-reasonably effective in counterbalancing the offensive weapons, or whether it'll be more like guns where, okay, well, everyone's got them, and so we just act very, very differently. My guess is it's going to be more like the latter. It's like, yes, you can go and trash talk Kellogg's all you like, but like, Kellogg's can't really do much to stop you.
Yeah. No, I think that's right, because especially we're starting to see the ability for non-technical users to take advantage of AI, right? Like, now it's becoming more and more possible to build something with AI without code. Mm-hmm. Like, coding is starting to become nice to have, not a must have, right? Which will then, depending on what you're building. And I think as these agents, as these things get better and better, I think you won't need to have a career as a developer, this lifelong familiarity with coding to strike back at things like this. Like, if someday, I think the everyday, like, if some mom at home was like, gosh dang it, stop giving my kid food dye Kellogg's, like, she could go on a rampage and kind of do it. I think it is empowering to the everyday person, which is a theme we have seen a lot with AI, that it really does allow everything from a one-person corporation to, finally being able to accomplish writing a book, like whatever it is, it empowers the individual and equalizes the playing field.
Yeah,
I don't think that like the concerns about it consolidating power are without merit either. But the thing that I would like to always point out to people is that, like, companies and countries were doing a fine job. Once again, just going back to like the Markov chain, right? Like, there were so many surveillance algorithms, et cetera, developed prior to this that probably still continue to serve their purpose better than generative AI will.
That's for sure. And you could argue the same about the internet. The internet gave people at a distance to spread. It gave people the ability at a distance to spread ideas. In an almost peer-to-peer way. And I would argue endlessly if necessary, like an LLM. In fact, probably best to train the LLM, set the LLM on the task of arguing endlessly, that it's a net benefit for humanity that we're able to debate with one another. And I think it's net benefit for humanity that we're able to automate intelligent tasks. It's like, that's all it is at a basic level.
Yeah.
And this seems obvious, like in the same way that engines were good, but sometimes people use engines for... Have you ever noticed that the invention of fire must have come from a moment where someone was playing with fire?
Hey.
I think fire is probably, net benefit to humanity, but we got there because someone was playing with fire. So
yeah,
I think that's interesting.
And
that's a theme.
That's another. Yeah, I was going to say that's another theme that I see constantly is that going, with the example of playing with fire. I see a lot of anti-AI people, ironically, citing the story, the myth of Prometheus. I just have to think, like, I don't think you guys actually read that myth. Like, the whole point was like, yeah, sure, like introducing fire created all sorts of new problems in the world, but it also created solutions to old problems,
right?
And enabled humanity to address the next level of development
and to level up.
Right.
Yeah.
Brave new world.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Truly.
Well, Sam, as we wrap up, we're so grateful for you coming on and sharing all these
thank you
thoughts
so
and
much.
everything.
Of course, it was fun.
I'm curious, as we wrap up, if there's one with this AI revolution just moving so fast all the time, unless you're OpenAI, then they like to drag it out for 12 days. But other than that, it's moving so fast. What advice would you give to people who are, in the AI space or out of it, to just stay current and to not get left behind?
Oh, interesting. I was about to say good answer. Good might not be. You could be the judge. But I had an answer until the last couple of words. Staying current is an interesting point, because actually the way that I see this is technology adoption happens in this like remarkably predictable fashion, which is that people get like cyclically overexcited about it. And then they think, it's going to change the world tomorrow. And it never does. Yeah. It will always not live up to those expectations by the end of what is typically, in one form or another, a bubble cycle. You see it, you could say it's like a financial bubble, yes, but also a mimetic bubble. The meme of the thing is spreading like virally at incredible rate during that period, and people think that the world will be changed in, we're going to be living in a different universe a year from now.
Right.
And the reality is that technology actually moves more like a linear pace, and it's fueled by these bubbles to some extent. Like railroads, there was a bubble in railroads in the 1600s or something, where they had about 20 lines of track laid, 20 miles or something, and the anecdote goes something like, and they had sold stock offerings for making more rail than there were lines of road in the UK at the time. Which, was probably a little bit irrationally exuberant at the time, but to write off railroads would have been very silly.
Yeah.
There is a sense, is this time different with AI? Maybe a little bit, but
yeah,
my hunch is that there will likely be a trough of disillusionment, and that is when to keep going. Like if it's clear in your mind why this thing is a rationally good thing to invest your time in, then don't just follow the herd. When the herd is really excited, okay, it might be an okay time to get into something, but you must not leave if it's a good idea when the herd gets irrationally depressed. Otherwise, you'll get nowhere. You'll just be like following them around like a sheep. Well, like the herd, in fact. So develop something you can, or like a model of the world that you think is coherent and you can stand behind, even when everyone else gets
I love that.
Emotional one way or another.
Yeah.
That's powerful. Thank you.
As we wrap up. Oh, sorry.
I just said it was a fun conversation.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. As we wrap up, what's the best place for people to follow you and Arweave and AO?
Unfortunately, it's still on the centralized web. I'm embarrassed to say.
We're working on changing that
someday.
Yeah. It's also a terrible name. I set this name, well, it's Sam E.C. Williams is my X handle, but it was when, like, in 2011 or something, for some CS degree project I was working on, and then I started using it, and then people started following it, and I was like, oh no, I can't change the name. And so here I am now in 2024.
Chained to it.
Yeah, but you can also find me at sound.arweave.net, where
Perfect.
I have a homepage on the PermaWeb.
Yeah, we'll drop links to all the things for people to follow.
Amazing.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everybody.